Good evening. I'm Anush Mehrotra, Dean of the George Washington University School of Business, and I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this special session of George Talks Business, which is also the first session since the pandemic started in person and online. Today's session is held in conjunction with Richard W. Blackburn Endowed Lecture on Civility and Integrity. This lecture series was endowed through a generous gift from GW alum and trustee emeritus Richard Blackburn to the School of Business and features world-recognized leaders addressing the themes of civility and integrity in business and public life. I am absolutely delighted to welcome this year's guest speaker, Dr. Dayna Bowen Matthew, Dean and Harold H. Green Professor of Law at the George Washington University Law School. Dean Matthew is a leader in public health and civil rights law who focuses on racial disparities in healthcare. She previously served on the University of Virginia Law faculty, where she also served as co-founder and inaugural director of the Equity Center. She is the author of the book, Just Medicine, A Cure for Racial Inequality in American Healthcare. Prior to that, Dean Matthew served on the University of Colorado Law faculty as a professor, vice dean, and associate dean of academic affairs. She was a member of the Center for Bioethics and Humanities in the Anschutz Medical Campus and held a joint appointment at the Colorado School of Public Health. Dean Matthew has also taken on many public policy roles. She was a co-founder of the Colorado Health Equity Project, the senior advisor to the director of the Office of Civic Rights for the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and a member of the health policy team for U.S. Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan. Before entering academia, Dean Matthew practiced as a civil litigator, both in Kentucky at the law firm of Greenbaum, Dole, and McDonald, and in Virginia at McGuire Woods. She is a recipient of several awards and was named one of the top 25 most powerful women by the Colorado Women's Chamber of Commerce. I am honored that Dean Matthew is here today to share her thoughts on intersection of civility, integrity, business, and law, and to discuss how our values of civility and integrity remain as the cornerstone of building a more inclusive and equitable society. A brief presentation by her will be followed by a moderated conversation, including questions submitted online and questions from the audience attending in person. Please join me in welcoming Dean Matthew.
So grateful for this opportunity. I have to say, I did note with great interest the emphasis on the word brief. He got very zealous when he said that word, didn't he? A brief presentation. I am so honored to be here. I am so grateful for the invitation. I am so grateful for the opportunity to be in the School of Business. I am so honored to be a selected deliverer of this endowed lecture, the Richard Blackburn Lecture. I will tell you, I did take a little bit of time to look online and see my predecessors, and I am fully intimidated. So I really, I thank you ever so much for considering me to be in the company of those great leaders and orators. I'm going to start by just sharing a few thoughts about the similarities between the School of Law and the School of Business. I consider this to be an opportunity not to be missed, because I am hopeful that I will be able to continue this relationship well after this lecture. So I'm going to start with our founding. The GW School of Business and the School of Law have much in common, and it begins with our origin stories. GW Law was founded in 1865, which, as you know, was the year at which we ended the bloody Civil War and entered an age of hope that our promise of equality for all might actually become true during the period of Reconstruction. And when I learned this fact about the university's law school, I asked myself, who does that? Who puts a law school in the nation's capital at the end of a civil war? Who does that indeed? You told me that was upside down, and I did it anyway. who does it indeed. This is a photograph of Pennsylvania Avenue, the Union Army walking and marching and parading down Pennsylvania Avenue in May of 1865. Doesn't it give you chills just to think about the fact that someone thought a few weeks after this, well, I think I'll start a law school. I think I'll open the doors to an institution dedicated to what I think the answer is clear, to building bridges, to solving some of the most intransigent problems of our society, for bringing people together, whether they be nations, organizations, corporations, families. I think that's why someone started GW Law. And let me turn then to the history of this great law school. I learned that GW School of Business was founded in 1928. Again, that gives me chills, because that's a mere few months before what turned out to be the largest downturn in the economic history of the industrialized world. And again, I ask myself, who does that? Who dares to start, let alone preserve, protect, and grow a business school in the center of the nation's capital throughout the Great Depression, when over half of American banks failed? Scores of terrible stories of death and destruction, unemployment at an all-time high. I believe, again, the vision was clear, that someone thought that a school of business and finance, marketing, management, accountancy, entrepreneurship, and economics, international markets, was needed at a time when this country was in the greatest moment of crisis and need. So it's in our DNA, both at the GW School of Business and at the GW School of Law, to come to our nation's assistance and aid when trust has been broken, when we are at our most divisive hour, when solutions are needed. Well, you heard in the introduction that I went to Harvard undergraduate, and the first woman president of Harvard University made a statement that I think unites the GW School of Law and the GW School of Business in our DNA, in our legacy for problem solving. And she said that in rapid succession, all other institutions of our society have failed the test of what I will now this evening call civility. And it is up to us, institutions of higher education, to serve society's highest hopes, highest ideals. And it's because of that calling that I feel especially privileged to talk to you tonight about civility. Put simply, our two schools have the privilege of occupying a footprint in the middle of Washington, D.C., in one of the most important cities in the world, because we do two things. We equip students and we produce knowledge that builds back trust and hope and a future whenever our society needs us. That's our calling. And so that brings me to tonight's question. I want to discuss civility. Now, they gave me civility and integrity and honor and truth and the American way. I can't do it all. After all, he told me I had to be brief. So I'm going to focus on civility. And I am going to quote first Professor Makisa Mortavi, who said, as passé as civility may seem, it can provide a needed baseline to facilitate productive interaction between parties who disagree. Doesn't that fit our history, our legacy, and our DNA? So what is civility? Civility is solving problems. Civility is building trust. Civility is a deep moral obligation that operates on two levels. On the individual level, it is what we commonly call manners. It's what your parents taught you and what you probably learned in kindergarten. On a societal level, it enlarges the term so that it is about citizens. And the Latin root, I took 4 years of Latin, and this is all I can tell you right now. The Latin root of civility is at a societal level about how citizens relate to one another and interact with one another. But so far, I haven't said anything that anyone here I think would disagree with, and that means I couldn't be a really good lawyer unless I found a way to be a provocateur. And so I want to talk about a more provocative side of civility, this way of living together, this way of being a part of democracy, this way of citizens interacting, and building bridges, solving problems, and building trust at inflection points when our nations, our societies, our families, and our organizations most need it. So for this, I'm going to go to our founder, George Washington. George Washington, it turns out, had a lot to say about civility. At age 14, this man, who was later to become the general, known as inspiring, a great leader, the only unanimously chosen president of the United States, and though he never went to college himself, the founder of this great university, also wrote a book. Better put, he copied a book. Because this book, turns out, bears the title now, Civility. You see it on the screen. It turns out it was a copy of 110 principles that George Washington found from a manual composed originally by the French Jesuits in 1595. And Washington copied these 110 principles and carried them with him throughout his life. So I want to refer to some of these. A few stand out. They range from the general. Rule number 1 is every action done in company ought to be done with some sign of respect for those who are present. We can all agree. I like this rule a lot. It's one of my favorites for 4 reasons. 1, it's a bright line. Every action applies. Civility applies to every action. Number 2, quite frankly, the bar is quite low. This rule says I owe only some sign of respect. Number 3, it equates civility with what I consider to be one of the all-time greatest songs of all recorded music history, Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. So this is the rule that I think is the most uncontroversial in the book. There's another I like a lot, rule number 58. Let your conversation be without malice or envy, for 'tis a sign of a tractable and commendable nature, and in all causes of passion admit reason to govern. Well, for a lawyer, this is especially useful because we do nothing without passion. We are nothing if not passionate. And you heard in the introduction that I am a civil rights and constitutional law scholar and activist. And so everything I do is about passion, but I'm also an academic. And so that I look for that passion to be governed with reason. I'm particularly fond of Rule 58. Now, there are some rules that did not make the cut of the 110. Spit not into the fire. Another one that's very obvious, Rule 100, cleanse not your teeth with a tablecloth, with a napkin, fork, or knife, but if others do it, let it be done with a pick tooth. All right, he thought that one was very important. I have 2 more for us tonight. One for you, rule number 6. It's advice for you, my dear listeners. Sleep not when others speak. And for me, rule number 80, be not tedious in discourse. So I will move on. What I want to discuss with you tonight is actually not just civility, but the problem of uncivil civility. The problem of using civility improperly, even as a weapon. So for the rest of the few brief minutes that I have, I'll lay out the problem first, and secondly, recommend a solution, and I will be done. So it is common to talk about incivility and the problem of declining civility. It started in the 1700s when decency, respect, and veneration were called for by John Adams, and then several who would refer to this speech and this book would allege that others in public office, like Andrew Johnson, a drunken bore, it was said, had left behind the rules of civility. Stephen Carter, a law professor at Yale, later wrote that politics has declined in civility, and the characterization of voters he best described as barbarians were indicators of the lack of civility in public discourse. Justice Clarence Thomas wrote an essay that was published in the Oklahoma Law Journal saying that we have become uncivil and lost the nature of civility. According to a 2019 poll by Weber Shadwick and Powell Tate, the state of civility in America has declined such that 93% of Americans have identified the lack of civility as a problem and have been doing so since 2010. The blame goes around widely. The top culprit since 2010 for this lack of and decline in civility has been, you guessed it, the internet, social media, and the internet. But I will tell you that the blame goes around quite broadly. Others include politicians, whether they live in Congress or in the White House, the news media, Hollywood, protesters, the young, the liberal, the conservative, the religious, the military, the corporate. All of us bear blame. But let me say that not all see the lack of civility as problematic. Some have seen the weaponization of civility as problematic. Here, I will quote Dr. Amy Mashburn, who wrote in 1993 that the power elite of the United States of America, she was referring to the bar associations, my professional trade organizations. The power elite have weaponized notions of civility to police class, race, and ethnicity, to erect amorphous barriers to those to retain power among those who are privileged by calling others ill-bred, uncivil, or unworthy. The power elite in the organized bar associations, Professor Mashburn said, functions like a privileged class that promulgates civility as a code to promote its own interests and to maintain the profession of lawyering for the white, for the male, and for the wealthy. So I want to tell you a cautionary tale about uncivil civility. What you did not hear in the introduction is that I was born and raised in a city with not a great reputation for civility. North Carolina was where my parents were, and I will not disparage North Carolina. It was New York City, where I was born and raised. And in New York City, we once had a mayor, Rudy Giuliani, and he was the 107th mayor, and he ran a very civil government, according to him. In fact, announcing his second term in the 1998 address, he proposed to build a better, safer, cleaner, more civil city and civil society. He wanted to turn the city into a tranquil place. Among the initiatives that he used to accomplish this was zero tolerance for exceeding the city's 30-mile-per-hour speed limit, zero tolerance for jaywalking, zero tolerance for teachers without uniforms, taxi cab drivers without licenses, bike messengers without records of their performance. He ordered the police department to place taxi drivers on a 6-month probation, and this was termed Professor Giuliani's civility campaign. How did he talk about it? Here are some of the words that he used. Let me talk about the one that might be in many ways all of the initiatives and successes of my administration in terms that are, quote, metaphysical, esoteric, philosophical. It may be that the most important of all of my successes, he said, was treating each other in a civil and decent way. He said his administration would teach us to be polite. The messages across the press were instantly favorable. They had titles like Be Civil or Else. Op-eds complimented civilization is playing by the rules, and playing by the rules has returned to New York City. And some things went very well. Crime rates in New York City dropped precipitously, a record decline in homicides and a 60% decrease in crime overall earned Rudy Giuliani high marks from New Yorkers of all backgrounds. He had an 80% approval rating immediately after the September 11th terrorist attacks. But we know later that this cautionary tale did not end well. He went from having this 80% approval rating after September 11th to being banned from appearing on the Fox News network because of his false claims about the 2020 election, to having his law license suspended in New York and in Washington, D.C., of being investigated by the FBI. And he did this because of his lack of civility, I suggest. Civility is not speaking ill of one another. And unfortunately, Mayor Giuliani did this quite often. He told us who did and did not love their country. He incited mobs by using expletives to decry politicians against whom he was running. Although those he was ruling got out of control, on occasions, he got out of control with them. Civility is not intransigence. Uncivil civility refuses to speak to leaders, as Mayor Giuliani did, saying, what happens when you engage in dialogue is you compromise. This is not civility. Civility is not inequality. And unfortunately, during the term that Mayor Giuliani ruled New York City, not only did the welfare rolls reduce by 500,000 people, which politically I have no view one way or another, but the inequality of how his policies affected the poor, the disenfranchised, the marginalized, and the minoritized is not civility. Civility is not believing that those who are most like us are the most civil, the most acceptable, the most well-bred. And when we treat civility this way, we invite a backlash of the nature that we have seen since, by some authors' argument, 1960 and 1970, where instead of civility being the value that we hold highest, that incivility has been a mark of authenticity, of courage, of manliness, of truthfulness, incivility as a virtue, speaking truth to power, no matter how the words come out. Protest movements have honored incivility as their trademark. In the workplace, incivility has become a mark of being tough, tough on crime, tough on lateness. And what is the result? Well, polls tell us that incivility is very costly. 48% of those who experience incivility in the workplace say that they have decreased their effort, decreased the quality of the services, taken their frustration out on clients and customers, and 12% say that they have left their jobs. So you see, uncivil civility has a cost. And what we should do, I think, the solution I propose, is that we return to the lessons that strength is not civility. Even though, as he was named Person of the Year, Time magazine said it is a tower of strength that recommends Rudy Giuliani. I would say it is a tower of compassion, of caring, of connectedness that is true civility and recommends us one to another. So returning to George Washington, I think there are two more lessons to be had. Rule 65, speak not injurious words, neither in jest or in earnest. Rule 69. If two contend together, take not the part of either unconstrained, and be not obstinate in your own opinion. In things indifferent, be of the major side. Before closing, I want to pause on this last one, Rule 69. Let's not get wrong what our cautionary tale did, and that is let's not be obstinate. Let's not take a side without understanding the perspective that others may hold. We can be civil in our disagreement. We can be accepting in our discord. We can be honorable and respectful, as is the GW way, to bring people together at their times of most bitter divide and disagreement. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. And so I'll leave you with this, which I think is a summary of the civility that we all should seek. This is a picture of redwood trees, which appear to be individually strong and tall and standing and towering on their own. Although I'm not an arborist, I do know enough to know that it is only because underground their root system is connected, intertwined, and codependent that these trees can stand individually tall. This is my picture that I wish to leave with you about true civility and what is needed for us to carry on the tradition of our founder, George Washington, in promoting civility in our mission to equip students and produce knowledge for a society in need. So thank you.
Thank you. Very brief, but very compelling, thought-provoking, and inspiring comments from you, Dayna. So I want to follow up. Of course, I know there'll be some questions. We have a mic on that, on my left there, if you want to start moving your, getting there, because we will end this program at 7 o'clock. So if you have a question, go ahead and please line up there. But let me start by asking a couple of questions. You mentioned, for example, that internet, which may be some of your underground connection versus the other kind of connections, but it is responsible, on the other hand, unlike the redwood trees, to be really causing some civility issues in the world. Now, that's not going to go away, but let's talk about solutions in any case. Civility has changed over a period of time. So how has civility changed in the last few decades? And particularly, if you start looking at the pre-pandemic world and now where we are, there's a lot of regulations, lot of issues that companies have had to adopt, which has created some kind of political issues with their various constituents. How can corporate culture really promote civility in an atmosphere where there's so much division, as you point out?
So I like that you ended the question with the word division, because I think the solution for corporate America and for all of us is to reverse the division, to remind ourselves of how truly connected we really are. One of the results of the pandemic, and I'm sure you experienced this here at the School of Business, was that we found out what it meant to be truly isolated from one another. I don't know about your students, but my students found that very difficult to study in isolation, to be in one place without connection and networking with their friends, with their family, with their community. I think building a culture of connected community is the challenge of civility. I think that is the solution, and why I refer to the network of roots. I think if we reverse the sense that we can stand alone, it is the way that we could quite possibly increase and reverse the decline of civility in America.
So, excellent point. And as we noted, as you noted, there were several rules that are still, from George Washington days, is still applicable, and we should be following them, and you summarized them very well. But let me just go a little bit deeper into this question, because one of the questions that was submitted, actually from a law school alum, was about this, and I'll make it a little more civil in the way it was submitted. May not have been as civil. So let me just point out that it is about this divide, that when there is so much division, it is almost like one side is drowning out the other side. And civility, as you pointed out, seems to only be associated with your side, and the other side is always uncivil. How do we make inroads in that atmosphere to change this political climate, and for that matter, extending it to any climate, whether it is the business climate or otherwise?
My parents used to say that the rule of the house was that we could disagree, but we had to disagree agreeably. I think this is the answer to how we can reverse this notion that I'm the only civil one and you must be uncivil if you disagree with me. One of the reasons I liked the two final rules was, and especially the last one, one of the reasons is because civility is recognizing the humanity in the other. It is recognizing that your disagreement with me, your difference, and the fact that we are divided on this rule does not make you less or me more. It does not make me necessarily right. I can hold a view and hold in tension a competing view without denigrating the person who holds that competing view. I think it is that task that is so important for the way that we educate students, that we equip them here at GW to disagree agreeably, to understand that we can accept a broad range of viewpoints, to accommodate differences of opinion, of background, of perspectives, even of vision, and to do it agreeably. That's the task of higher education, and I think that's the challenge we meet so well here.
So I'm going to follow up on that, but I will remind you one last time, if you have a question, please do go to the mic so that I can call on you. But let me follow up a little bit on that. You mentioned how we do that well. And yet, the issues, whether it is civility, whether it is ethics, whether it is integrity, these are considered by us in academia to be the cornerstone for preparing our students to really be leading a civil life with civility and with equity and with inclusiveness. What are some of the things that professional schools like law and business, how can we advance that concept?
Oh, we have to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. So in the classroom, we have to admit students from a wide variety of backgrounds, a wide variety of cultures, and make sure that they are invited into the conversation throughout the entirety of their education to bring themselves, their backgrounds, their history, their differences right front and center into our conversation. We have to look, secondly, at our workforce. We want to make sure, as an institution of higher education, again, that we're walking the walk, and that our faculties are diverse, our leadership is diverse, our staff is diverse. Some of the ways in which I have seen this play out is actually borne out in the literature. I study implicit biases, implicit racial bias, gender bias in particular. And one of the best prophylactics against bias are counterfactuals. People in roles of responsibility, leadership, training and teaching, those who stand behind the podium, write the articles, host the interviews, being examples that contradict stereotypes, that smash all expectations. So as an institution of higher education, we can do that. We can do that in our hiring practices, in our promotion, in our tenure practices. And then lastly, if our student body is diverse, and our faculty, staff, and administration is diverse, then our curriculum and the knowledge that we value and disseminate must also cover the spectrum of points of view. I think in this way, we not only fulfill our task of equipping students, but we help society by pushing out knowledge and information that can open the eyes of all who are looking to lead and serve in a pluralist society.
Those thoughts really resonate, of course. And then you mentioned not just as an institution, but also perhaps individual accountability. And individually, we could be demonstrating and living that exact same thing, right? So let me change topics just a little bit because there were some questions around your other work that you have done, which are connected to this. You wrote an introduction for a healthcare symposium issue, and it was called Healing Hate, a public health perspective on civil rights in America. Maybe can you talk a little bit more about the title and share a little bit about the research on the impact of social injustice generally, and perhaps using healthcare as an example, since that is your expertise?
Thank you for getting that article. Almost nobody read it, so I really appreciate that you pulled it up. It was a great conference.
This is the advantage of having people submit questions too, by the way.
Yeah. I don't think that article got the attention that I was hoping, and here's what I intended there. As I said, I study civil rights and I study health. And in my view, the disparities, that is, the differences that are avoidable and unfair in health outcomes among populations, are a canary in the gold mine, if you will, that show us how inequitable and uneven our society is. Healing Hate was a conference that said, to the extent that we allow hatred of others, whether it is sexism, homophobia, racism, when we allow the hatred of others to infiltrate our society, indeed our medical care system, we hurt everyone. We hurt everyone, the data tells us. Take racism. Racism kills not only the victims, but also the perpetrators more quickly. We know, for example, that in a societal location, let's say a county, where we do a Google scrape and find out how often a racial expletive was used for a search engine, those places where a more frequent and higher concentration of uncivil discourse occurs have higher death rates among people of all races. And those places that have a lower rate of uncivil discourse have healthier populations across the board. So Healing Hate was a way to call everyone into account for the ways in which hatred, otherwise known as incivility, hurt all of us, and look for ways to heal all of us by eradicating racism.
Excellent. Let me ask you to build on this a little bit more. What would be the key principles for building a framework for policymakers and the public that will help challenge this hatred, challenge this discrimination, and build a more inclusive and equitable society?
So here is the secret sauce about civility, in my view, and here I'm going to get a little bit lawyerly on you.
I'm not arguing with you.
I understand. Let me say, I will do it in the most civil of all possible ways. I think civility is about process more than substance. I think the keys are how we conduct our discourse, how we interact with one another, and civility shaping that process is more important than making sure that we have one key principle that we all must abide by. If I were to point to one thing that I think went wrong in my cautionary tale, it was the idea that civility was a thing. Civility is something that I would like to suggest is a verb. It's what we do. So I think the key is, as George Washington said, how we speak to one another, how we respect the humanity of others, how when we disagree, we don't become obstinate, and we respect that there are viewpoints and perspectives that are not our own. In these processes, I think, lie the secret to civility, much more than being strong or tough on crime, or even requiring that you don't spit in the fireplace. I think it's more about how we comport ourselves as citizens related one to another.
Well, we have certainly followed one important principle on civility that you referred to. Nobody, I was watching, so I was certainly not asleep. Nobody was sleeping here while you were talking, I can assure you. I know we are almost at time, 5 minutes within that time. So let me still ask you one other question, if I may, which is also something that is a combined question from the ones that were submitted. You know, many of our students choose to come to GW because of our reputation in international business or international affairs, the opportunity to have an international experience, to enjoy this beautiful city of Washington, D.C. Can you talk a little bit about how civility, integrity are somewhat different potentially, or are they the same across the international boundaries globally?
I love that question, and I think we must recognize that civility is a function and reflection of the culture and society in which we sit. I would say that the answer to your question is that it's different from society to society. There probably are some core principles. Respect is expressed in one society differently than it's expressed in another. I'm going to take as an example in my own world, in my own life. I was brought up in a very working class part of the Bronx, the South Bronx. And we had certain rules for respect and how you comported yourself if you were a kid, a teenager. But by fourth grade, my family figured out a way how to get me out of the South Bronx and bus me across town to Riverdale, which is a very Tony area of the Bronx, same borough. But I found I was in a different world. I might as well have been in a different country with respect to the rules of civility. So there, in Riverdale, I was allowed to call adults by the first name. It was most uncivil to do so back in the South Bronx from where I came. I remember when my first really big crush came over to visit me, wink, wink, Nancy. And at my house, this young man who was perfectly civil, respectful and honoring in Riverdale, sat at the table, cross-legged, and ate with his hands. My family was aghast. This was, as far as they were concerned, the most disrespectful person that they had ever come across. It turns out that he was being comfortable and respectful, and when he got up from the table and went to the refrigerator to get seconds, I thought my mother was going to have a heart attack. You just don't do that in the South Bronx. You don't go to somebody else's refrigerator. Mm-hmm. So the rules of respect and civility are different. So one of the things that I learned, and I learned it on a trip throughout the Pacific Rim, that when you are a guest in someone else's home or country, you interrogate their rules of civility and interrogate their rules of respect. And insofar as is humanly possible, in order to communicate your respect, you observe their cultural norms.
Very well said, very well said. And of course, being in academia here, we need to understand our diverse student body as well as our faculty and staff. And we need to be appreciative of the different ways of showing that civility.
I think that's right.
What thought-provoking, very inspiring. Thank you for being here today, Dayna. I also want to thank all of you who joined us today and invite our alumni to the reception on the 6th floor at Dukas. We also invite you to join us for the next episode of George Talks Business next week. Our guest will be Marty Rogers, Market Unit Lead of US South at Accenture. Again, thank you for being here today, and see you next week. Beautiful. Very much.